There is a great divide in the video community between YouTubers and filmmakers. We're both creating content for people to consume, but the real difference is we come from different places. YouTubers probably grew up watching YouTube. They saw PewDiePie and they're used to things like jump cuts and awful resolution. They're probably watching on their smartphone. Whereas the filmmaking generation came from watching classic films, all filmed at 24 frames per second with a 180-degree shutter and probably displayed on big, huge screens. This divide leads to a lot of conflict on simple things like camera features. Canon can release some new camera that's absolutely perfect for vloggers, but then the filmmaking community finds out that it doesn't have 24 frames per second and they're absolutely losing their mind. How are they going to publish something at 30p like a dirty YouTuber? I want to go over what these differences are, kind of where they come from, so maybe we can agree that we're different, but not necessarily better or worse. First, let's talk about frame rate. Since the beginning of cinema, most films have been created at 24 frames per second, a number that was not chosen because it was the best, but because it was the cheapest possible way to provide tolerable amounts of movement in motion pictures. If you went slower, like to 15 frames per second, everybody perceived it as jerky. But higher frame rates, people certainly can perceive the faster, better, more realistic quality of 60 frames per second video. And that's good and bad. If you're a YouTuber, I believe higher frame rates like 60 frames per second make people feel a little bit more intimate with you. They make it feel more real, like you're there in person. I believe that because when we started experimenting with shooting at 60 frames per second, people didn't know that I was shooting at 60 frames per second, but I got a lot of comments like, there's something about this video that makes me feel like you're in the room with me. What is so lifelike about this video? People didn't know it was the frame rate, but they felt it. On YouTube, people often use a very small mobile device that can't display high resolutions, but it can display 60 frames per second. My little experiments on you showed that people did appreciate that higher frame rate, and it does feel more realistic, but for filmmakers, that's actually a problem. The Hobbit, a very famous movie, was filmed at a higher frame rate, 48 frames per second, and even multiple of 24 because they didn't want to split off too much, and critics hated it. The 48 frames per second felt more realistic, but it also felt like it was revealing too much of the set. It made people's acting feel a little bit less realistic. Through The Hobbit's 48 frames per second experiment, we all kind of learned that actors were hiding a little bit in the relatively jerky 24 frames per second. Another key part of the divide between filmmakers and YouTubers is resolution. In our own statistics, we found that 2 to 3% of people watched video in anything greater than HD, so like 1440 or 4K, an insignificant number. The vast majority of people watched video at 720 or below because mostly they're using their smartphones. I was watching YouTube on my 4K TV and I realized YouTube actually was scaling it down to 720 for some reason, even though 4K video. I don't know why it would do that, but the fact is, even if you have a high resolution screen, YouTube might not be showing you the high resolution video. On the other hand, filmmakers are often required to use high resolutions like 4K. For example, Netflix requires you to film stuff in 4K. So if you hope that your production might be shown on Netflix, you better be shooting 4K. And certainly if you're planning it for the big screen, the more resolution, the better. Filmmakers are passionate about choosing the correct shutter speed when filming, whereas YouTubers tend to not care at all. Filmmakers are usually shooting at 24 frames per second, and they want to use what we call a 180-degree shutter. That means that their shutter speed should be twice their frame rate. They want a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. By basically keeping the shutter open for half of the frame rate, you end up with some amount of motion captured and some amount of jerkiness captured. This perfect compromise has been used in film since the beginning of time, and every movie that you saw as a kid, you watched it at 24 frames per second, and 1/50th of a second, and that's kind of what film has come to mean to you. There are some exceptions. Sometimes when filming an action scene, the filmmaker will decide that they want to give it that sort of jerky appearance, and they'll go ahead and shoot at a higher shutter speed. But shooting at a fixed shutter speed is not easy. You probably have to use a neutral density or even a variable neutral density filter to get the shutter speed dialed in exactly. And some high-end cameras have these built in. Some smaller cameras like the Sony ZV-1 have some amount of ND filter built in. But if you're really careful about it, that means that every shot that you set up, you're adjusting a filter to get that perfect shutter speed. I used to do that because I've been a YouTuber long enough that I was learning video from people who had filmmaking backgrounds. And so they taught me that that shutter speed was really, really vital to use. And then one day I forgot my ND filter and I had no choice but to shoot at 1/1000th of a second. And you know what? Nobody mentioned it. Nobody cared. And then in the future, knowing that nobody cared, I began to question, is it worth me pulling out my ND filter and spending a couple of minutes getting it set up? Ultimately, I decided no. But I will add, when we set up this indoor studio with controlled lighting, I did go ahead and use a 180-degree shutter here because why not? I only have to set it up once. Focusing is a big divide between YouTubers and filmmakers. In filmmaking, you have a dedicated camera operator behind the camera. Often, you even have a dedicated focus puller who's just in charge of the focusing and nothing else. As a YouTuber, you're pretty much always filming yourself. So, filmmakers will want to use manual focus. They will require features like punching in, zooming in to verify focus, or focus peaking. They often also need a big separate screen so that they can really see it close up. Whereas YouTubers, we want to set the camera up and then walk in front of it and just have it get the right thing in focus. And thus, cameras like, let's say, the Panasonic S1H, an excellent camera for filmmakers, has a little bit of wobble to it when it's doing continuous autofocus, meaning for a YouTuber, it's less than ideal, but for a filmmaker, it's kind of perfect. YouTubers require a Flippy screen because we generally don't have somebody behind the camera. It's not out of vanity or narcissism that we want to see ourselves. We want to be able to control the composition, verify the focus and exposure, change camera settings while we're in front of the camera. It's really basic operational stuff. But filmmakers have dedicated camera operators behind the camera. They generally don't have any need to flip the camera forward. This comes up with cameras like the Nikon Z6 and Sony a7 III, which filmmakers love because they're low cost and they produce excellent results, but they lack a flip screen. So if you're a filmmaker and you're using those, you think they're great bargains and you'll give them 5 stars. But if you're a YouTuber and you can't see yourself or operate the camera from the front of it, 0 stars. It's completely useless to you. And we get into this big debate when new cameras are released and they don't have a flip screen, because the YouTubers will say, this doesn't have a flip screen, you cannot use it for video. And the filmmakers will say, well, no real filmmaker is looking at the screen from the front of it anyway, you narcissist, so why don't you shut up about it? And people really do get heated about it, but we just have different workflows and different structures. So we kind of need different cameras too, right? Editing is very different between filmmaking and YouTube. You might have noticed that up until this point, if I screwed up talking, I just made what's called a jump cut. I literally just cut the video in 2 places and squeeze it together. That is completely a no-go in filmmaking. With filmmaking or even like documentary work, you always have to switch cameras. And that's why we have multiple cameras here in the studio. But honestly, I often don't bother even firing up the other cameras because literally nobody complains about jump cuts anymore. Chelsea and I had this moment several years back when we finally used jump cuts for the first time because, like I said, we learned video from filmmakers and jump cuts were an absolute no-go. But we only had 1 camera with us. We did not have enough time, so we filmed it and we jump cutted it so we didn't have to do everything in 1 take. And people loved it. They absolutely loved it because it felt more like YouTube. And even though it was technically a lower production value, it was a lazier style of editing, Just like people love to see that 24p and 180-degree shutter because it reminds them of the great films of their youth, when people see jump cuts, it reminds them of the sincerity and close connections they feel to other YouTubers who were there doing it themselves with a single camera and had no other choice. So it's kind of ironic, but lower production values on YouTube help communicate the sense of genuineness and intimacy. And higher production values, like having multiple cameras, feels a little disingenuous, almost like corporate. So if you're a YouTuber, go ahead and try out jump cuts. People just might like it. Dynamic range is a big difference too. Filmmakers need to be able to shoot these very high contrast scenes where they want to capture all of the details in a very bright sky, but still capture a fairly dark subject in the foreground, for example, somebody in a car. Video will typically convey 8 or 9 stops of dynamic range, but you might need 12, 13, 14 stops of dynamic range to film a scene like that and capture both the deep shadows and the bright highlights. Lots of video cameras have a reasonable solution for this. Something like Vlog or S-Log, where the entire scene is filmed very low contrast, and then in post-processing you expand that contrast. We also use that for a long time making our YouTube videos, but we found it to be an absolute pain. And we actually found that it produced a great more noise in our videos and generally made everything look worse. As a YouTuber, if the sky behind your head is blown out, like literally nobody ever cares. They don't care. They are so accustomed to seeing people film with absolute crap cameras, they care more about the content anyway. Filmmakers tend to have a dedicated director of photography, a DP, that wants to make the film look beautiful. YouTubers tend to be more focused on the content. It doesn't mean that they don't care at all, but a few clipped highlights, not a big deal. We see this come up in camera reviews. A new camera comes out and it's video-centric, but it doesn't have vlog. People are totally mad. Or a new camera comes out and it supports raw video, and filmmakers get excited and YouTubers don't care at all. There's a great divide in sound too. Filmmakers tend to have a dedicated sound person. They are not allowed to have the microphones visible in a scene, thus they need to either tape lavalier mics under people's clothes, or they have the boom operator who's got the handle. Filmmakers also have the option of going back and dubbing scenes and carefully editing the sound so everything sounds great. YouTubers need to film something quickly and have it be good enough. Sound really does matter on YouTube, but seeing a mic, people don't mind that at all. I'm wearing a lab mic right now and people are just like, yeah, that's the mic he's using. I don't need to hide it and act like I'm not wearing a mic because I'm not playing a character. I'm Tony sitting in my studio. But even for YouTubers, lab mics are kind of a pain because they can brush against your clothes and make scratching sounds that you're not going to hear because you don't have a dedicated sound guy. Or if your clothes don't have a proper lapel, you might not have any good place to pin them to. And that's why so many YouTubers end up using a shotgun mic mounted directly to the camera. Maybe it could be closer, maybe it could sound better, but this is kind of the best you can do without putting a bunch of time into it. YouTubers and filmmakers have a very different workflow too. Filmmakers almost always have dedicated editors. They have processes for ingesting the video, making proxies, backing everything up, distributing it to different people who are going to review the dailies, color it, etc. YouTubers, well, we need to get the video onto our phone or computer and edit it and publish it as soon as possible. Filmmakers are lucky if they produce a film a year. We have produced 1,300 videos in the last 8 years. So everybody wants to be efficient, but YouTubers have this kind of frantic pace where nothing can really slow us down. And for that reason, we don't want to go back and mess with raw video footage that needs to be carefully colored. A filmmaker could take the time to stabilize video in post. A YouTuber could do that, but we'd rather it happened in camera. A filmmaker who wanted to do a time lapse could shoot 5,000 raw photos and very carefully match the exposure and blend everything and render it to a beautiful video. A YouTuber would probably rather just have all that happen in camera so they could quickly drop it into Final Cut and get about the day. So I ask you, why is there such a hostile divide between filmmakers and YouTubers? We have related jobs. We use much of the same technology, but there doesn't need to be a "I'm better than you" thing happening here. We're both found ways to make a living doing what we love, to communicate, to share with people. We have different priorities, we have different budgets, we have different techniques, but we're all brothers, right? So let me ask you, what are other differences between YouTubers and filmmakers? In what ways should YouTubers learn from filmmakers and vice versa? You know, one other difference I can think of is the way we use lenses. Like, filmmakers need these sort of matched sets of lenses because they're filming a single scene with multiple different lenses. And if the color or exposure or t-stops are a little bit different, cutting from one to another is going to look terrible. But because YouTubers always use the same lens, we can just use any old lens, and if it's off, at least it's off in the same way throughout the whole video. Okay, write a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks. Bye.